Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kirsten Monroe and I'm the Associate Editor of Science and Society, a journal of Marxist thought. Thank you so much for joining us for Guy Debord and the Society of the Spectacle. This is the 7th installment in Science and Society's online lecture series. Proudly independent of any party affiliation and non-sectarian since its founding in 1936, Science and Society is the longest continually publishing Marxist scholarly journal in any language and was the first to appear in English. Science and Society resists exclusive identification with any particular trend or school of interpretation within Marxism and does not attempt to give Marxism precise boundaries or definition. If you find today's presentation valuable, I hope you will subscribe to Science and Society or to ask your library to subscribe. Information about subscriptions is available on the website of our publisher, Guilford Press. I would also like to encourage you to think of Science and Society as a potential outlet for your work. You can find more information about the journal and the submission process at scienceandsociety.com. The format of today's event will be 4 15-minute presentations from our speakers, followed by around 30 minutes of questions. If you're a young person, including but not limited to students and early career researchers, please make a note of this in your question in the chat, as we would like to particularly encourage your participation today as part of our ongoing effort to support younger generations of Marxists. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers. Tom Bunyard is senior lecturer at the University of Brighton and author of Debord, Time and Spectacle, published by Brill. Anselm Jappe is professor of philosophy at Accademia di Belle Arti di Sassari and author of Debord, published by University of California Press. Larence is head of collections in the Département du Manuscrits, BNF, and was responsible for the publication of Guy Debord's reading notes in the Édition La Jappe collection La Librairie de Guy Debord. Eric John Russell is enseignant at the University of Paris 8 and author of Spectacular Logic and Hegel and Debord, published by Bloomsbury Academic. I'd like to note that he also has an article coming out in the July issue of Science and Society that we're excited about. And so with that, Larence, would you like to begin? You'll have to unmute.
Excuse me. So hello, everybody. I will just begin by presenting Guy Debord for those who don't know him. So Guy Debord was born in 1931 in Paris. He spent his youth on the French Riviera and came back to Paris after high school. He had met the lettrist, an avant-garde movement founded by Isidore Isou during the Festival de Cannes in 1951, where Isou was showing his treatise of slime and eternity. Once in Paris in the autumn 1951, Guy Debord meets up with the lettrist again, joins the group, participates in a few scandals and hangs out in the ill-famed café of the back streets of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, on the margins of the touristic, arty, and intellectual center of the Rive Gauche. He co-founded successively 2 avant-garde movements, the Lettrist International, which lasts from 1954 to 1957, after basically excluding Isidore Isou of his own group, and the Situationist International, which lasted from 1957 to 1972. The Situationist International was founded as a mostly artistic movement by the reunion of 8 members of various European avant-garde groups. But the Situationist International became, from the early 60s, on a more and more politicized movement up until the May 68 riots in Paris, in which Guy Debord and his friends took an active part. His most well-known work is The Society of Spectacle, published in 1967, which was one of the most important theoretical references of May 68.
Thank you so much. Eric John, would you like to go?
Yes, just move this. Okay, Yeah, let me begin by, of course, thanking Science and Society for this opportunity and helping, put this panel together, especially to Kirsten Monroe, and of course to my esteemed panelists and all the participants that are here today. I wanted to use this opportunity to begin the discussions with a brief presentation of my recent book, Spectacular Logic in Hegel and Debord, Why Everything Is As It Seems. As Kirsten said, it was published earlier this year with Bloomsbury. And I'm going to admit, right, that until a paperback comes out next year, the book remains kind of prohibitively expensive. But if people wanted to read it, I'm sure something can be arranged if you just get in touch with me. But my aim today, to start us off a little bit, is to offer a few central yet general points that outline the kind of why and what of my approach to Guy Debord's theory of the society of the spectacle. But I think it's worth first emphasizing the significance of the scholars participating in today's discussion. Together, their work, and I unabashedly include myself here, does a great service towards kind of exercising Debord away from the discourses in which he is conventionally situated. Since, as Larence says, the 1967 publication of his book, The Society of the Spectacle, of course, it's become a ubiquitous observation to say that we live in a society of spectacles, whether we're talking about television, advertising, social media, and usually Debord appears as a kind of theorist of media distraction or consumerism, often canonized within postmodernism or art history, media or cultural studies. But my own research abandons these kinds of approaches and instead offers a sustained examination of the concept of the society of the spectacle through the two pillars upon which I think Debord understood his work as a critical theory of society. These two pillars are Marx's critique of political economy and Hegel's philosophy. He illustrates as much in a December 1971 letter. He says, "I will affirm to you straight away, I understand perfectly what I have written. Obviously, one cannot fully comprehend it without Marx, and especially Hegel," end quote. But before our discussions get into Debord's important engagement with Marx and Hegel, let me first begin with a kind of general concept of the spectacle just to orient us a little bit. Debord outlines the extent to which the commodity economy under the capitalist mode of production has throughout the 20th century developed into a form of social relationships that are mediated or held together by appearances. For Debord, these appearances come to dominate human beings as a kind of objective power over and against them, despite them being the result of human activity. And I'm sure this will come up again, but this is an idea we can trace back to Marx's idea of the fetish character of the commodity. But more specifically for Debord, with the fragmentation of human experience through the capitalist division of labor, through the structuring of our social relationships, through the form of the commodity, for Debord, the spectacle is a kind of reconstitution of unitary social life from its separated and disjointed or fragmented moments. Now, precursors to this kind of idea of unity, we can find in especially the writings of the young Marx, which Debord was intimately familiar with. So, for example, accompanying scattered remarks about the abstract universality of religion or speculative philosophy, within these early writings of Marx, there figures also a kind of abstract unity of the state, civil society. Debord was intimately familiar with these abstract forms of unity. But in my view, it's actually the later Marx, specifically in his writing Capital, it's the form of money that stands, in my view, as the strongest precursor to the idea of the spectacle as a kind of organized appearance of social unity. In the money form, we have a kind of collection of a collection of commodity values that, in the form of money, assume a kind of objective and unifying visualization. Marx calls it the money fetish is dazzling to our eyes. But in any case, not to get too deeply into this point, the central question of my book is what does Debord mean by the category of appearance? How is the organization of appearances resulting in a social reality held together with what he calls positive cohesiveness? So my argument, though, is that in order for this kind of diagnosis to acquire full coherence, both the logical dynamics of Marx's critique of political economy, as well as Hegel's speculative philosophy, have to be made explicit. But in doing so, I argue that Debord didn't simply find within Hegel's philosophy, for example, the language necessary to talk about the problems of 20th century capitalism. Instead, in my view, Debord's critical theory, Hegel's logic, and I won't get into it too deeply, but his logic emerges as a kind of really existing rationality. Yeah, not something that just sort of takes place, in our heads, but a rationality that is an existent or active force in the world that gives cohesion to society's forms of appearances. In a word, we can say the level of conceptual thinking that we find in Hegel is argued to be the actuality of the society of the spectacle. Now we might ask, okay, what justifies bringing these two different levels together, right? These distinct ontological levels, concept or logic and actuality or reality. Well, in my view, just as it was true, or just as it was the case for Adorno's critique of Hegel, for me, it's the principle of identity that legitimates this kind of connection. For me, Debord's theory at its core really is a logic of commensurability, an identity we can say of and within difference that's historically grounded in the principle of commodity exchange. And so for this, the spectacle is a kind of social structure of unity and separation. It gives identity to seeming dualities or antinomies or oppositions. And the examples I cover in my book include unities of work and leisure, of state and economy, of town and country, of geopolitical or factional differentiation, of media personalities or celebrity and other kind of competing models of individuality, of economies of state planning versus unregulated free markets, of high and low culture, politics and entertainment. All these kinds of conceptual oppositions, I argue, in the logic of the spectacle, for each of them, each is a condition of and for the other. And in my view, the revolutionary kind of import of Debord's diagnosis is that you cannot abolish one side without the other. This logic of commensurability or of reconciling differences is what I name as the spectacular logic of the spectacle. It proceeds through what Hegel calls the identity of identity and non-identity. It's a mouthful. But in other words, through this kind of rhythm of exchange value, a rationality of unity in which, with exchange, two commodities, despite being different, are rendered somehow commensurate. So my argument really it's that this aspect of Hegel's logic, this sort of dimension of identification that renders differences commensurate, this constitutes the spectacular logic of the spectacle, a kind of structure of domination, which overcomes division in a sort of positive unity. And so on the whole, tracing Debord's diagnosis out of this kind of Hegelian lineage, while also, of course, following the central role of appearance forms in Marx's work, this highlights the merit, I think, of theorizing capitalism in terms of a modality of appearing, we can say. How am I doing on time? Am I okay, Kirsten?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm a little more than halfway done. So everything I've said so far, this is the kind of what of my interpretation of Debord. But I think it's worth emphasizing the why. And my answer is twofold here. The first I've already alluded to at the beginning, right? That is by bringing Debord closer to Hegel's philosophy and Marx's critique of political economy. And though I haven't mentioned it today, also on Adorno's critical theory, but the significance of this move, pertains to the fact that spectacle remains a largely kind of misunderstood concept. And so in my view, it's crucial to sort of cauterize his work against the dominant interpretations. These are interpretations that usually contrast appearances as false or images as simply illusory and not real against some kind of underlying more authentic or true reality. I think this is a mistake interpretation for reasons maybe we can get into during the discussion. But the more important sort of merit I place on my approach is how we might sort of help elucidate the pertinence of Debord's diagnosis beyond the historical moment in which it was initially written. Indeed, in providing a kind of reconstruction of spectacular logic like I do, and in all seriousness, my book does adopt the perspective of the Society of the Spectacle, or we could say an account of the vanity of the world it aspires to create. But in doing so, my aim is to kind of purify the terms of Debord's diagnosis beyond mere contingency. Yeah, to kind of distinguish the essential determinations. And by that, I mean, what essentially makes it what it is and not something else, in order to evaluate its lasting significance beyond this moment of post-war prosperity and written in the late 60s. So in other words, in my view, I'd like to determine its explanatory power beyond the period of post-war abundance. And as a result, I provide a kind of reconstruction of the spectacle as an eminently logical system, perhaps even against Debord's own wishes, but one that's, I think, ultimately justified by the prerogative to expel from critical theory, to expel from the critical theory of society, any of the indeterminate, capricious, or arbitrary orientations so prevalent within what today goes under the name of critique. It's my contention that only through this logical kind of reconstruction can the Society of the Spectacle, as a distinctly critical theory of society, be brought to bear beyond its historical moment, right? Beyond the idea that it's a critique of consumerism of that period. Right, following the post-war period and up until today, right, we can easily enough discover a reconfiguration of spectacular dynamics, we might say. Poverty assumes the appearance of individual responsibility. The state assumes the appearance of an obstruction to circulation flows. The commodity assumes the appearance of base survival. A satiated proletariat assumes the appearance of a good credit score, etc. Now, none of these kind of phenomena, in my view, are coherent without a logically existing structure of appearances and forms of commensurable identification that I describe as constitutive of the spectacle's logic. So through this sort of dialectic of appearances provided by Debord, I think we can grasp a sort of underlying logic of domination at play within contemporary forms of social cohesion. So I conclude now with just two fundamental theses that I've extracted from Debord's diagnosis that I think are worth bearing in mind and maybe we can return to in the discussion. Just two. The first is that the Society of the Spectacle, I think, is most adequately understood as a critical theory of society in which appearances of different social phenomena necessarily relate to one another and produce a false totality, or a presentation of wholeness. In other words, it's a critique that acquires its full coherence only in making explicit a kind of interconnecting logic of society as a whole. And the merit of that diagnosis is that a fully elucidated totality, right, or presentation of the whole, it makes swift work of half measures, we can say. So for example, a scrutiny of particular images or representations in society, of course, they can yield a bunch of empirical studies. They might even help to lubricate certain labor markets, but they go silent the moment such images become, let's say, more realistic, more representative, or more empowering. In other words, there's immense illusions involved, I think, in efforts to emancipate this society by perfecting it. I call this a kind of nominalistic approach to Debord's theory of spectacle, in which the spectacle is seen as sort of an irrational, parasitic infestation, let's say, on what is otherwise a decent world. So blame is placed on mere excess. Yeah, tell me.
Just a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I'm on the last paragraph, I swear. But in readings like that, right, blame is placed on, unreality or images, illusion, or an elite that's manipulating the masses. So here, the spectacle as a kind of unity of appearances is ignored, but its individual phenomena is held with sort of cynical esteem. And so against this approach, a critical theory of the spectacle ought to extend itself beyond problems of representation, beyond problems of wealth differentials, and look closer at what makes the spectacle a kind of totality of accommodating differences. My last point, the second thesis. Ours is a strange period. It's an era kind of abounding with promises of greater exposure, visibility, transparency, with the prerogative simply to be noticed. There's a kind of omniscient publicity and clarity with which the world publicizes or broadcasts its turmoil. And I think that's a unique sort of development. And so with this in mind, I think we ought to place emphasis on the spectacle as a critical theory of society whose appearances also serve to ratify or legitimate and justify that same society. We might conclude then that with the spectacle, the mere disclosure or exhibition of misery and catastrophe, which of course hardly anyone denies anymore, is not a sufficient or even maybe necessary condition for their undoing. So in other words, the way in which the logic of the spectacle operates through the exposition of social reality becomes part of the mystification of that social reality. So I think I'm just going to leave it there. I have a few more comments, but these are just two concluding theses that I wanted to introduce into the discussion. Hopefully they'll come up again, later on, but I'll leave it there and thank you all again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for those great remarks. Our next speaker is Larence.
So I will complete my presentation of Guy Debord at the beginning by a presentation of his archive. As you've been told by Kirsten, I'm working at the French National Library in the Department of Manuscripts, where I am in charge, among others, of Guy Debord's archive. This archive entered our collection in 2010 and 2011, after being declared national treasure in 2009. A national treasure is a specific designation for items of very high importance regarding the French patrimony. How this could be possible for an author who declared being hostile to the state? That was the question often asked in the press, many journalists talking about recuperation. Let me just precise some details of the story. A manuscript or any patrimonial object can be declared national treasure in France only if the owner or the seller have asked for a certificate to make it possible for him to sell it abroad. In this case, we have the possibility to forbid any transfer abroad by declaring it national treasure, which obliges the French state to buy it under 3 years, otherwise the movement certificate is granted. The people who vote to grant this national treasure status have to judge, after being presented by librarians like me, the reasons why we think we should keep the items in French collections. Therefore, the state, ministers or president have nothing to do with this decision, taken only by the people, part of the commission dedicated to this examination, except that the verdict has at the end to be confirmed by the culture minister. I wanted to tell you about that just in order to be clear. The Guy Debord's archive have been judged of high importance like any other document which is the memory of a work which left durably his mark on the next generations. It is the case of Guy Debord's thought, mostly in social critique and art, but also in cinema, in literature, in philosophy. His Society of Spectacle remains major work to understand how capitalist economy proceeds to alienate people. His archives have been made available for readers very soon after they arrived. What do they contain? We can separate them in two parts: the documents related to Guy Debord's works and the documents related to the Situationist International. The first part is made of his manuscripts or published works, of published works or unpublished notes. His correspondence, his personal objects or photographs, and a lot of reading notes. The second part is made of tracts, flyers, reports, photographs of the Situationist International conferences, manuscripts of other authors, documentation about radical movements in France and abroad. This archive tells us a lot about how Guy Debord himself considered the matter of preserving archives. He kept them very carefully, meaning that he considered of high importance to keep it, because through these documents, it is a memory of a movement, of an action, of people, part of it, which can be preserved for the future. Without any documents to prove something happened, an event or an action could vanish forever, or being interpreted in a wrong way. Since the Guy Debord's archive has been sold, we have to note that since the Guy Debord's archive has been sold, many of the members of the Situationist International also sold their archives, mostly at the Bunyard Library in Yale, making us discovering that even if they were part of the counterculture, they were all conscious of the importance of these documents as a patrimony. What kind of information can readers find in Guy Debord's archive? First, I have to say that researchers came immediately in 2011 to consult this archive. Several of them were at this time writing or achieving their thesis, and they could find there information about how Guy Debord worked, about who Guy Debord read, about what he kept from his relations to other groups or counterculture movements. Indeed, his archive reflects his life and thought. In a way, they are like another part of his panegyric, for which was published 2 volumes, one during his life in 1989 and one posthumous in 1997. And he intended to publish a 3rd one, for which we keep notes in the archive. This panegyric, we can read it, and I insist, truly read it through his reading notes. Guy Debord didn't like writing on the books. It would also not have been a convenient way to keep information available for his daily work while he was often traveling or moving. He chose to write quotations he wanted to remember on flying sheets, using systematically from about 1964 white little cardstocks. He wrote on it quotations he agreed with, sentences he highly appreciated, judgments he disagreed with, sometimes adding a precise destination for his work. Like, for example, when he writes for S du S, which means for Society of Spectacle. Or sometimes he wrote an intention of détournement. For those among us tonight, we don't, today, sorry, it's tonight for me, we don't know much about this practice. The détournement is probably the most well-known and later most reused situationist practice. It was defined and described by Guy Debord and Gilles Volleman, again in the Belgium surrealist journal Les Lèvres Nues, in a text entitled Mode d'emploi du détournement, User Guide to Détournement. The détournement consists of reusing, diverting, repurposing of pre-existing cultural elements. It can be visual and or discursive. There often is something humorous or sarcastic about them, and this ironical practice, especially what was called the erotico-politic poster, has been coined as typically situationist and vastly reused in the May 68 events. The reading notes are so important to understand together the way Guy Debord worked to write his works, the way he read and thought, and tell us so much about his sensibility, about the most important matters for him, about how he was considering human life on all the deepest themes of human lyricism, to quote him in a note published in Lire Debord in 2016. From the first moments we discovered Guy Debord's archive, it was indeed clear to me, and Emmanuel Guy worked with me on this archive for 4 years and curated with me the Guy Debord's exhibition in 2013, that we would have to make them available through publications, we would have to make available through publications the unpublished material of the archive. That was made first in 2016 with the book Lire Debord, and with the authorization of the right owner, Alice Debord, I next began to publish the reading notes with the collaboration of 4 other people. Guy Debord archived his reading notes in files such named philosophy, sociology, poésie, etc., poetry, stratégie, histoire militaire, strategy, military history, Marx, Hegel, and history. We choose to keep these names, which will lead to the publication of 5 volumes. In the 3rd volume, published last May, we decided, for which Anselm wrote a postface, we decided to put together Marx and Hegel because of the way they are linked to the genesis of Guy Debord's masterpiece, The Society of Spectacle. Putting the 3 of them together, Marx, Hegel, and Debord, in the same book, reaffirmed the close connection between their thoughts and between the trajectory of the historical and political critique of the society and of the economic system each of them theorized. Therefore, this book may provide good food for thought to anyone who wishes to improve and update this historical and political critique of the society. As we have a few minutes left, I will share with you some photographs of documents which can be found in the Guy Debord's archive. Oh, so can you activate the screen share, please, Kirsten?
I'm trying to. I'm so sorry.
No.
Let's see. You should be able to now. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I think so. Okay. So can you see it? Sorry. Sorry, I tried to do it better. Okay, so can you see it? Is it okay? Can you see?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So here are some sentences Guy Debord took in books or magazines, and he used some of them to make his first book, Mémoire. It was his first book, and it was made with drawings of Asgorion and sentences taken in books. We have the part of the sentences he didn't use. Here is the manuscripts of Debord, the manuscripts of his first movie in 1952, Hurlement en faveur de Sade. Here is, so he made, I didn't tell it in the presentation, but he made a few films. So in the beginning, in the 50s, il made Hurlement en faveur de Sade, critique de la séparation, sur le passage de quelques personnes à travers une assez courte unité de temps. And here we have, he was very precise making his films. And here we have the notes for the time of each scene for critique de la séparation. Here is the manuscripts of the Society of Spectacle made of 3 notebooks. Here are some notes for unpublished work for the project Apology, which was, some notes were used for panegyric, but other notes were not used, and we published them in Lire Debord. That's the kind of unpublished note we published. Here are the reading notes, so in different kind of sheets, and here are the sheets, the white cards he used from the beginning of the 60s. Here is it's a reading note about Marx. Here is his Kriegspiel. He invented and made a Kriegspiel, and we have it in the archive. We have the prototype and we have the game, which were made. There is only 5 items of this game. Here is a tract and its version in English. It was a tract from the Lettrist International. Here are some other tracts. And one of the most important tracts of the Situationist International, because it defined the program of the action of the Situationist International, construction de situation, situations, construction, urbanisme unitaire, architecture situationniste, psychogéographie, détournement d'éléments esthétiques préfabriqués, jeu permanent et comportement expérimental auquel, which leads to the dérive. So here are the actions, the program of the Situationist International. Here is Guy Debord when he was young in the French Riviera, and he was with friends, and they came back to inscribe Izu on the I don't know in English, the balise we saw in the sea. And here it was also on the French Riviera in 1951 when Guy Debord met Isidore Izu. Here they came back to meet him at the rail station. And here is a letter Isidore Izu wrote to Guy Debord, criticizing his first movie, Hurlement en faveur de Sade. Here are some members of the Lettrist International. And here it is a photography of the foundation of the Situationist International in Cosio da Rossia in 1957. And you can see in these manuscripts, it's very, very humorous manuscript because you see that only 5% voted for the foundation of the Situationist International. It was a very little movement. There were very few people at the beginning, and it never counted more than, if we add all the members of the Situationist International during the time it existed, it's only 70 members, not more. So it's a manuscript in which, it's very interesting, it's a manuscript in which Debord wrote the connections between different avant-garde and counterculture movements leading to the Situationist International. And there is a photographs of Guy Debord during a realization of film.
Maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes.
And that's all.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much, Larence. Our next speaker is Tom.
Cool, right. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kirsten. Thank you, everybody else. I am going to try to show you some slides because I want to work through some quotations. So let me see if I can share my screen as well. Right, have you got that? Yeah, good, cool, okay. Right, so let me time myself. If Kirsten, please interrupt me if I go over 15 minutes. Right, okay, go. So I'm going to try and do a few things here. I want to kind of foreground the sense in which this is not, I want to talk about the society of the spectacle. I want to foreground the sense in which it's not just a description of society, it's an attempted intervention. I want to base everything around that. I want to say, if you foreground that, it's easier to foreground that if you acknowledge the importance of history, the massive importance that Debord places on time and history. If you want to engage with that, you need to kind of get to grips with the way he's thinking about time. And I'm also going to try to suggest that if you do that, you might be able to make a bit more sense out of his notion of spectacle. That's what I'm going to try to put forward. And because I'm worried about losing my timing if I go off piece completely, I'm going to work from a script, which is a bit dead and lifeless, but I'll see how I get on. So, as Eric John said, within Anglophone academia, and I think within Francophone academia as well, Guy Debord's 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, often seems to be viewed as little more than a diatribe about modern capitalist visual culture. The spectacle that it describes is typically identified with the great mass of fads, fashions, brands, adverts, screens, and entertainment that swamp modern society. This reading is not altogether wrong. Debord does indeed describe news, propaganda, advertising, news, propaganda, advertising, and the actual consumption of entertainment as specific manifestations of the spectacle. But I think this kind of reading affords only a very limited grasp of the book's concerns. And he indicates as much right at the start of the book's first chapter, where he says that the spectacle cannot be understood either as a deliberate distortion of the visual world or as a product of the technology of the mass dissemination of images, which is pretty explicit. Only a few pages later, he says that the mass media is only the spectacle's most stultifyingly superficial manifestation. Now, if these media phenomena are only superficial manifestations of a deeper problem, the obvious question is, what is the problem from which they are arising? And I think we can take a step towards answering that question by looking at the following lines, which are from a letter from 1973. I know I'm going through this a bit quickly. I apologize for going fast, but I'm worried about the time. So in this letter from 1973, he says, behind the phenomenal appearances of the spectacle, for example, television, advertising, the discourse of the state, etc., one can find the general reality of the spectacle itself as a moment in the mode of production. Okay, so Debord's concerns in this book are clearly tied to ideas about capitalist social relations. We know this is obvious. The first sentence of The Society of the Spectacle reworks Marx's opening lines in Capital. Debord also tells us quite explicitly that the spectacle corresponds to the historical moment at which the commodity has completed its colonization of social life. And I think that once we begin to address this side of Debord's work, and if we also acknowledge his debts to Hegel and Marx, you know, in the line that Eric John quoted earlier on, the book soon starts to look like an account of a society that's become characterized by fetishism and alienation. And I'm going to try to really quickly sketch what that might look like in very, very broad outline. But if you want a better version of it, go and read Eric John's book, which is very, very good. Hooray for Eric John's book. Buy his book or steal his book or do something, but Eric John's book, very, very good. Right, now when viewed in this manner, very, very quickly, the society of the spectacle can be understood as an account of a society that's become subordinate to its own economic system. We have a society in which the actions and interactions of human agents, and indeed their desires, aspirations, and identities, have become shaped and structured by the dictates of that same economic system. This is a society of spectacle because it renders human subjects passive observers, as it were, of their own alienated, of a world shaped by their own alienated objective activity. It's a world in which they act and interact in response to the options and incentives that are presented to them, which they do not fully control. And when seen in these terms, Debord's rather perplexing claim that we are spectators of our own lives, I think that can be understood really as a complaint about the lack of autonomy, or at least that's the kind of line that I want to kind of push. I said earlier on that Debord's book is often understood as an account of mass media. That's true. But I also think that the view that I've just sketched out is becoming increasingly accepted and acknowledged. So in the time that I've got here, because that view is increasingly accepted and acknowledged, I want to try to complicate it slightly by connecting it to Debord's ideas about time and history, because I think Debord's ideas about time are central to all of his work. I want to do this by showing how they relate to his political goals. And the first claim that I want to make here is that this book was not intended to function as a work of sociology. Not that I've got anything against sociology, but I mean, he uses that word to refer to kind of descriptive accounts, but rather as a contribution to a revolutionary project. And that point can be introduced with the following quotation. In the letter that I quoted earlier on, he says, the theory of spectacle can only be justified by reference to these three degrees: simple technico-ideological appearances, the reality of the social organization of appearances, and historical reality. Now, I understand this to denote three different aspects or levels, if you like, of the theory's attempt to understand modern society. The first of these is the most superficial. We said earlier on, stop-spangly superficial manifestations. It concerns the media phenomena with which Debord's theory is most commonly associated. The second concerns the social organization of commodity relations, which I've just really quickly kind of sketched out. But I want to suggest that that third level, the one about history, historical reality, is in some ways the deepest and the most fundamental. And that's because it concerns just what is so wrong in Debord's view with spectacular society, and what should replace that society. In other words, the notion of history alluded to in this quotation is directly connected to the book's intended function as a contribution to revolution. And we really have to foreground this. He's really explicit about it, and I don't think we do him justice if we don't foreground this, because he says this is what it's about. He says in his 1992 preface to the book's third French edition, the book has to be read bearing in mind that it was written with deliberate intention of doing harm to spectacular society. In the preface to the fourth Italian edition, he's really explicit. He says you're just not going to understand the book if you don't bear this in mind. You've got to put yourself in the position of the actors. He says, he's quoting Clausewitz, and the position of the actors in this case is an attempt at revolution. So I want to try to suggest that the book is not just a description of society, it's an attempt to identify the nature and stakes of a revolutionary struggle against that society. And that Debord's ideas about time and history are central to this. So, for example, he says in a letter of 1969, historical time is both the milieu and the goal of the proletarian revolution. But what does that actually mean? I think it means that the goal of revolution for Debord is to create a social condition that would allow human agents to take direct self-determinate control over their own collective lived time. And that's necessary, he thinks, because we are at present separated from our ability to govern our own time. It's a kind of major theme for him in the book. He in fact consistently presents spectacular society as marked by a lack of any such engagement with historical time. For example, spectacular society is said to be characterized by a deficiency of generalized historical life, by a condition of historical paralysis, by an abandonment of any history founded in historical time, and thus by a false consciousness of time. Now, I've used the word history a lot, I know. I want to try to explain what I have in mind when I'm using that word, because it's complicated. Or more specifically, I need to try to say what I think Debord thinks history is, or how he uses the word. Now, he doesn't tell us, predictably, because he doesn't ever make life very easy. Doesn't tell us explicitly what he means by when he refers to history. But it seems clear that he doesn't just view it as knowledge about the past. nor does he just view it as the discipline of studying the past. Rather, history for Debord is something that we do. Its history in his usage is something that needs to be made. So history, in other words, is as much about the construction of the future as it is about reflection on the past. So when he says modern society is a historical society in which history is not yet lived, what I think he means is that this society exists in historical time, but we're not really in charge of our own historical existence. We're not really taking charge of our own existence in time. We are mere spectators of a way of life in which we participate, but which we do not control. And this is why historical time is both the milieu and goal of the proletarian revolution. The point is to take charge of our own collective existence in time. This is why you have a déterminant of the Communist Manifesto. Obviously, the opening of the Communist Manifesto, there's a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Debord says history itself is the spectre haunting modern society. There's a direct identification between communism and history, some kind of condition of realized historical life. So in sum, modern society is characterized as having become separated from its own history, or rather from its ability to shape its own future. And the task of revolution is to remedy that state of affairs. Right, now having made these remarks, I'd like to try to say something about the way in which they inform his concept of spectacle. And according to my stopwatch, I've got about 5 minutes, so I'll see how I get on. Okay, right, let's see how we do. So this requires saying a bit more about temporality. Okay, so Debord's conception of temporality, I think, was shaped by a combination of French Hegelianism, existentialism, and ideas drawn from the young Marx. Not going to talk about that because it's too complicated, but I think it's there in the mix. That's the kind of cocktail that feeds into it. And that combination of influences is evidenced, I think, in his remark, quotation, man, that negative being who is to the extent that he abolishes being, is one with time. And the quotation in that quotation is from Hegel's Phenomenology. And I think, just put it really simply, the basic idea here is that we shape ourselves and shape our world through the actions and experiences that we undergo in time. But Debord also stresses that the way in which this takes place and the way in which we understand our own temporal condition, which is crucial, is always shaped by the social formations that we inhabit. He says the temporalization of man is affected through the mediation of a society. Okay. Now, the idea here seems to be that different social formations think about time in ways that reflect their understanding of their own historical agency. And that claim, strange claim, but it's set out in the 5th chapter of the Society of the Spectacle, which I think is, in some respects, one of the most important chapters in the entire book. It is very rarely discussed, but it's really, really crucial. The chapter traces the development of different conceptions of time through a series of different social formations. It runs from the very earliest human societies up to Debord's present, and it sets out a line of development whereby humanity's power to shape its own historical existence has grown in tandem with that power's separation from its producers. Now, I haven't got time to outline that here. It's really complicated and interesting, but and problematic in various ways, but it's great. I'll simply sketch out what I take to be the basic premises that kind of chapter depends upon. And firstly, temporality seems to be inextricably interwoven with sociality. And that's because it's interwoven with the operation of social power, i.e. the capacities produced by and available to the inhabitants of a given social formation. And it seems that for Debord, all such power is ultimately the power to shape history. And I think that makes sense because all such power is at root the power to govern what happens in time and to shape how events, actions, and possibilities are conducted and understood. So the central claims here are that different societies have possessed different abilities to shape and understand their own historical existence, and that differing degrees of access to such power will afford differing degrees of autonomy. This is identified throughout the societies of the past, but the problem is held to become extreme within the present. Modern society is cast as a kind of crux at which humanity's power to shape its own history is greater than ever before, but at which that power is also further removed from its producers than ever before, due to the fact that it's become monopolized by the economy. So he says, though separated from his product, man is more and more and ever more powerfully the producer of every detail of his world, yet the closer his life comes to being his own creation, the more drastically he's cut off from that life. And this is kind of like the fundamental contradiction in modern society that he identifies. Now, I think this line of thought can help us to understand, or at least this is the way I understand Debord's rather enigmatic concept of spectacle. And as I understand it, the basic problem of spectacle is separated social power. It concerns the separation of social agents from their collective power to shape their own time. And the way in which Debord understands this is informed by his reading of Feuerbach. For Feuerbach, in religion, we worship concentrated bodies of our own collective power and potential. I think Debord's notion of spectacle is really very similar. And when we have that in mind, we can make a bit more sense of the ways in which Debord and the Situationists used the terms spectacle and spectacular, because they didn't just use it to refer to the commodity. They also use it to refer to phenomena that are not easily reducible to the commodity and its derivatives. Religion, hierarchy, political leadership, dogma, etc., are all viewed as instances of spectacle. And I think this is, so what do all these things have in common? Well, in all such instances, you could say, social agents become subordinate to concentrated bodies of their own collective power. So to summarize, as I understand it, the basic problem of spectacle is the separation of historically formative power from the direct conscious control of its producers and its fetishistic localization in seemingly independent bodies. That sounds really general, I know, but it allows an interpretation of Debord's indications that the problem posed by spectacular society is in fact very old. He consistently located the advent of spectacular society in the early part of the 20th century. But he also states, all separated power has been spectacular. At the root of the spectacle lies the oldest of all social specializations, the specialization of power. That power draped itself in the outward garb of the mythical order from the very beginning. And in his correspondence, he even traces it all the way back to antiquity. The spectacle has its basis in Greek thought. It increased through the Renaissance, still more in the 18th century. It appeared under its completed form around 1914 to 1920. But that's important, it appears in its completed form around 1914 to 1920. So spectacular society seems to have made explicit a problem that has been implicit throughout the social formations and political struggles of the past. How am I doing? Can I do one point, Kirsten? Do you want me to stop?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah? One more point, or should I stop?
Oh, you could do one more point, no problem.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try to be really quick. The claim then, spectacular society seems to have made explicit a problem that has been implicit throughout the social formations and political struggles of the past. And I think we can see some of that in the way in which Debord and the Situationists are reconceiving the proletariat. In classical Marxism, the proletariat, broadly speaking, were all those who've been separated from the means of independently maintaining their own existence. You know, you've got to go to work, otherwise you're not going to eat. For Debord and the Situationists, however, the new proletariat that they identify were all those who've been separated from the means of independently shaping that existence. So this amounts to replacing material poverty with a kind of generalized existential poverty. The subordination of everyday life to the commodity was held to have generalized this problem, spreading it across traditional class boundaries. So for example, he says, the new proletariat are the vast mass of workers who've lost all power over the use of their own lives. And in the journal, they say, it's all those deprived of the possibility of altering the social space-time that society allots to them, regardless of variations in the degrees of affluence or chances for promotion. So it means that the modern revolution can be viewed not as a demand to take control of the means of production, as in traditional Marxism, but rather as a demand to take common possession of the means of shaping life itself. And I think we see this in the Society of the Spectacle, where he says, he talks about, you know, the demand to live the historical, in the demand to live the historical time that it creates, the proletariat finds the simple, unforgettable core of its revolutionary project. There seems to be the idea that modern society has clarified and foregrounded something that's been a problem all the way through the past. You know, it leads the revolutionary project to become visibly what it always was, essentially. And I better stop there. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you so much for that great talk, Tom. So our final speaker is Anselm.
You have to unmute, Anselm.
Excuse me. So it's a pleasure for me here to speak about Tom's and Eric John's book, those two persons which are now since several years, and I more or less I accompanied with some small counsels the writing of their books. But it is a special pleasure for me to discuss about these books. It is not only as a polite phrase that I say it, but also for a very special reason. So I apologize, but now I would like to read you a page of one of my own books, so it makes you understand maybe better why I was so interested in Tom's and in Eric John's books. So I would like to remember, that's not to make an advertising for my own book about Debord, but just to remember that it was published in 1993. Debord was still living, first in Italian, and when afterwards in 1999 it was published in with University of California Press in the translation of Donald Nicholson Smith. But I wrote an afterword where I especially stated out that Debord in a few years from the status of a marginalized, obscure person had become a kind of superstar in culture and counterculture. And especially that Debord was very much recuperated, as the word goes, by especially by postmodern reading, by readings who saw him as a kind of media theorist, or other readings which especially insisted on the literary on the special quality of writing that was special historian Franks, or also on which also focused on his exceptional life. So I wanted to remember also my afterword to the English, to the American edition, that the most important for me is the political and the, let's say, philosophical dimension of Debord's work. And so I wrote, so I just want to read some lines of my book. In any case, the present work, that I mean in my own book, defends quite another view, namely that Debord's theory is in essence a continuation of the work of Marx and Hegel, and that its importance inheres for the most part precisely in this fact. Those who have no interest in the Hegelian dialectic and in Marx's interpretation of it, or in the authors chiefly responsible for keeping this line of inquiry alive, run the risk of, or rather will succeed in, understanding very little of the society of the spectacle. Debord's work itself effectively demonstrates, through none of the academic or subcultural accounts acknowledge this, that Hegelian Marxist concepts are still the most useful for understanding the modern world, particularly the self-destructive character of a society driven by the commodity. Only now, in fact, globalization having finally realized the notorious totality, is Hegelian Marxist theory really coming into its own. And it is no doubt for this very reason that our accredited intellectuals have for quite some time, with rare unanimity, been declaring that nothing could be as out of date and irrelevant as the concepts of Hegel. Hegel is the greatest absentee of the day, surpassing even Marx in this regard. For even Marxism is acceptable to a degree so long it is guaranteed Hegel-free, so long as it is analytical, structuralist, or ethical in character, to name the leading variants. Hegelian Marxism is generally dismissed, both within and outside academia, as the deadest of dead dogs, as a supreme instance of the kind of totalizing theory and grand narrative that modern society has declared itself loudly and clearly unwilling to countenance. In resorting to such exorcisms, official knowledge follows a sure instinct, for without the categories of the Hegelian dialectic, no matter how much they need to be reversed, turned upside down, or transcended, all understanding of capitalist society must remain in the best of circumstances fragmentary and devoid of any possible application. It will be what the Situationist International called research without directions for use. Even such truths as may be found by means of non-dialectical methods will be unusable or turned into falsehoods unless they are integrated into an understanding of their totality. This concept seemingly constitutes the horror maximus of politically correct thinkers, but hardly more tolerable to them are the dialectical concepts of the difference between essence and phenomenon, and of an objective truth distinct from the empirical one, or indeed any sense that every phenomenon is a result and hence explicable only in terms of its historical genesis. This is not the place to debate whether the Hegelian interpretation, according to which every singular phenomenon is but one moment in the process of becoming of a totality, has universal ontological validity and holds good for every historical period. What is indisputable is that such a negative totality does indeed exist in the case of capitalist society, because the all-pervading logic of commodities concedes no autonomy to any other reality, and hence that only a form of thinking based on the totality can adequately account for the situation in which we find ourselves. For postmodern thought, this conclusion is both forbidden and strictly meaningless. How exactly so then I end by saying the Hegelian dialectic permeates the entire first part of Capital, Volume 1, where Marx explores the basic determinants constituted by value, commodities, and money, with their profoundly contradictory and ultimately self-destructive character. This analysis of the self-form today represents Marx's most vital legacy, and Debord's recovery of it is undoubtedly one of its main achievements. The best example of a Hegelianizing concept in Marx is that of abstract labor, discussed in some detail in this book. And so I go on also by stressing the importance of an understanding of Hegelian categories in order to understand also the core of the society of spectacle. So in 98, I posed this more or less as a kind of necessity, but me myself, I did not continue on this line of inquiry, since I was also interested in other subjects, especially in the elaboration of the critical value. And unfortunately, I have to say, for more or less 20 years, nobody continued to investigate this philosophical, especially this Hegelian dimension of Debord's theory. And so it was a glad surprise to see that finally two authors published at a very close distance two very big and very learned books about that subject. And naturally, I also have to say I was quite surprised to see that it was done by persons from the Anglophone world or from English universities. At least in Europe, we think that English tradition is so much linked to empirical tradition that there is nearly no place for conceptual thinking or for Hegel's philosophy. So I think you might be quite a big exception in the English academic world. So just to add some words to what I said, it's also late. So now, I was always talking about Hegelian Marxism, and actually I was more interested in the Marxian side of Debord, and in what Marx himself owes to Hegel and what Debord owes to Hegelian interpretations of Marx, especially in Georg Lukács and his history of class consciousness. So what is so I have to admit that this interpretation was interested in Hegel mainly as a kind of forerunner of Marx. What is the originality of Eric John's books? But he's also interested in Hegel, let's say, by himself. So what Debord owes directly to Hegel, and especially to the science of logic. So normally the book, Hegel's work, which most impressed also normally his modern scholars is a phenomenology of spirit. And it is also has to be said that in Debord's reading notes, which Larence exposed us, the biggest part is about the phenomenology. But Eric John also said that even maybe without having read completely the science of logic, since the reading notes are only about the introduction, but Hegel, but Debord seems to structure his whole book as a kind of modern remaking of the science of logic. This is also interesting there to say that Marx himself, he wrote to Engels that for writing Capital, it was quite useful to him, but that he just read a second time the science of logic, in a book which has been bestowed upon him by Bakunin. That's just for the little history. So it is true that in the book which has been published now by Larence, and for which I had the honor to write the afterword, we can see that Debord effectively had read several of Hegel's works, and not only the main works, but also some of his minor works, like the history of Germany. It has also to be said that Debord's reading of Hegel was very much influenced by Kostas Papaioannou, in Greek exiled to France, who published several translations and introductions to Marx. And I think this also probably is quite unknown in the English-speaking world. He was also a very important critic of the degeneration of Marxism. On the other hand, it must always be stressed, Debord did not start out at all as a reader of Hegel in his youth, and not of Marx at all. But Debord did never go to university. So Debord came from the mix, from the artistic Bohemia in the 50s, from the little world of lettrism and of attempts to revitalize surrealist and Dadaist ideas from the 20s. It was only in the second phase of his life, in the 60s, when Debord was already in his 30s, that he started to read systematically Marx and Hegel. So Marx and even more Hegel were, for Debord, a kind of to structure or to conceptualize his intuitions about the constructed situation, about the spectacle. But I have to say, neither Hegel nor Marx were at the origin of his ideas. It was a kind of way to strengthen what came first as more or less poetic or artistic origin. So himself, he claims that Lautréamont especially, and Arthur Cravan and others, and other kind of shipwreckers, as he called them, were at the beginning of his ideas. So I think there's not much time left to discuss more about Hegel, Marx, and Debord. I just wanted to say very quickly, so we have to remember that, as especially Moishe Postone pointed out in his book Time, Labor, and Social Domination, what really links Marx to Hegel was not so much putting Hegel on his feet, as Marx said, but by giving a materialist interpretation of Hegel's idealistic conception, but Hegel's idealistic conception of the world turned upside down are really a description of what capitalism really is. So when Marx, especially in his analysis of money, value, commodity, and abstract labor, he uses Hegelian categories, it is not by giving them a materialist twist, but just by showing that that the capitalist reality is really a kind of as Marx deems, calls a commodity, a kind of sensible, supra-sensible entity. So that also means that totality is not something positive in this kind of reading. So totality is a negative totality. Totality means also to unify the whole world under the only principle of spectacle. So totality is something which has been to be recognized. It's a difference to postmodern thinking, but it has to be recognized to be fought against, not something which must be reclaimed. And I say, so this is also an important reading, I say, from Postone and from the German critic of value group, which maybe is not completely clear in Debord and could be discussed one day. It should also some weak points in Debord's use of Hegel. So he refers also to the philosophy of history in Hegel, so the kind of optimism which goes about, at least around 68. So Debord puts himself very much on the idea that history must necessarily go towards revolution, emancipation, and that the march of history is necessarily a march which is not accepted by bourgeoisie, since it will lead to the end of all separations and to the reign of bourgeoisie. So this is quite very different from Adorno, who said more or less that the only certitude in history is a catastrophe coming, and not. But later on, without declaring explicitly his change of mind, Debord also was much more into this idea that history is running towards a catastrophe and not towards revolution. So I think so. I spoke already a lot also because I hope I didn't annoy the people who maybe read or remembered my pages from my afterwards, but I wanted to read them. But because I was struck by reading with these pages and see how much I called for the kind of book the books which finally Eric, John, and Tom wrote down. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anselm. So with that, I would love to open it up to, we went a bit over, so maybe 20 or so minutes of questions. At the start, I said I'd like to prioritize students, other young people for questions. So if you're a student or other young person with a question, you can put it in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. So any questions from young people, students, early career researchers? All right. So Alex, who just put the question, would you like to unmute and ask the question, or would you like me to read it? Maybe.
Yeah. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah. Thanks for the talks. This is, yeah, as I say, for Eric, John. What's the position of Lukács and Lukács's emphasis on praxis and on strategy in your sort of reconstruction of the logic of spectacle? Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, Anselm, his work has done a really great job of demonstrating how important Lukács is for Debord. But it's not necessarily from the perspective of ideas of practice or strategy, right? It's mostly through the this middle section of history and class consciousness in the category of reification or Verdinglichung. When Debord does talk about Lukács and political activities, it's, I mean, very, very critical. I mean, it's critical of essentially a kind of a vanguardism. And there's some sections in Society of the Spectacle where Debord sort of describes the party as Lukács understood it, as everything the party wasn't. So there's a real sort of strong distinction with Debord's engagement to Lukács in terms of, on the one hand, diagnosing a reified society, or a society that has, rendered the relationship between subjects and their world as petrified or frozen. This is part of the concept of reification. And Lukács's political activity, or the tradition from which Lukács's political activity is part. So I would just sort of emphasize that distinction. But it doesn't mean, real quick, it doesn't mean that Debord didn't take notions of strategy seriously. In fact, he took them immensely seriously. And as Larence has published recently, or a few years ago, Debord had collected immense notes on war strategy, war theory, and not just modern warfare, ancient warfare as well. So, I mean, just because Debord is disregarding Lukács's idea of practice doesn't mean he was not intensely involved in thinking about strategy.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I just remember that he told to Agamben, I am not a philosopher, I'm a strategist. So Debord never wanted to enter into the category of a philosopher.
Thank you. Any other questions from young people, students, early career researchers?
Well, how young do you have to be to put in place? What is the age limit?
There isn't an age limit. All right. So there's a couple of questions. If you've put a question in the chat, would you mind identifying if you're a student or not? Maybe in the meantime, we have a question from an editorial board member, Russell.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for those talks. They were really terrific, and I got a lot out of them. My question is mostly for Tom, if I may. You rightly identify in Debord that the idea is that basically everybody who's alienated and has little control over their lives are, agents of revolutionary change. And I think that there's something right about that. So it basically opens up the idea of the agent of revolutionary change. And this relates to the Lukács question as well, obviously, but opens up the notion of the agents of revolutionary change from a restricted view of the working class and the proletariat to just about everybody, including the lumpen proletariat and, people who are generally, have this sort of gray status somewhere on the outskirts of revolutionary agency. The question is, from, obviously from Marx's view, the capitalist class themselves were organizing on an important level the working class, but the organization of the those alienated, who have no control over their history, their lives, they're not being organized into a revolutionary force or one that is potentially going to have the power for that revolutionary force. So, and Debord in Society of the Spectacle, it seems to be very down on any kind of political activism whatsoever. He's really negative about it. And we just heard about how negative he is about the idea of a party as in Lukács, but he's down on really every kind of protest or every kind of, actual practical means of revolutionary behavior, as if they're just more spectacle, and that they're always looked at as more spectacle. And it seems to me, what's the intervention then? If every avenue of actual revolutionary behavior, let me speak that way, is mere spectacle and simply open to everybody, unorganized, masses who are not really very organized whatsoever, what's the intervention for the Society of the Spectacle? What intervenes and destroys it? What is the force that's going to make this happen? It seems like I'm not hearing that theory. I've never gotten that in Debord. I don't understand that about Debord. I'm not a Debord scholar, so I've just read the book many times in my life, but I'm not a scholar of Debord, so I don't really understand that in Debord.
Awesome, thanks. Let's go ahead and take a second question. Let's do two questions, one after the other, actually. Let's do Cormac and then Alexander, who just put the question in the chat. Would you guys each like to go ahead and ask your questions one after the other, and then the speakers can respond?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thanks very much for the talks. Very interesting. So I was, a while ago, I was sort of like looking through Derrida stuff, and I found that there's this collection of interviews on Jacques Derrida's on the, his self-titled documentary, and there's this one throwaway line where he says, "Oh yes, I've been reading a lot of Debord and I've been using it for my work in the 1990s." And so I was sort of wondering, with that in mind, if this makes you think about Spectres of Marx differently, and if there's a lot of, I guess, interplay for you between Spectres of Marx and the commentaire sur la société du spectacle, or if there are serious, unresolvable contradictions between how Derrida is trying to, what Derrida's project is and what maybe Debord's project of the 90s is.
Thanks for that question. Alexander, would you like to ask your question, and then our speakers can go ahead and respond?
Yeah, so my video doesn't work. My question is really just an attempt to get down to the concrete and contemporary from the abstract and theoretical. So I was just thinking about the phenomenon of conspiracy theories as yeah, related to the lack of agency or the lack of being in control of history. And so I'm just basically just throwing that connection out there as a way to gain a concrete insight into the ideas that you have about spectacular logic or spectacle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Would our speakers, I don't know who wants to respond, but you can go ahead.
Should I try and respond to that first question? I didn't catch the name. I'm so apologize to the person who asked the question. It was really hard.
I'm Russell. Yeah,
Russell,
it's a hard.
sorry.
Russell. Yeah, like
Russell.
Eric John Russell, but Russell's my first name. Yeah.
Okay. Really hard question. There's lots of bits to it as well. I don't know I'm going to be able to do justice to it really. I suppose the first thing to say is the question pertains to the issue of class in Debord and the Situations, which is a kind of famously kind of vexed issue, and people argue about this, and it's kind of a point where people kind of criticize them a lot. Some people praise them for moving away from kind of traditional class analysis. Some people criticize them for doing that, and they find problems coming out of it. So there's an issue there. One thing that might be of interest, if you've looked at the book, you're familiar with the book. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 5, I think it's thesis 127 or something like that. It's really interesting. He introduces class right at the moment where he introduces history. So in that chapter on time, he starts off, the first thesis says, here's how we're going to think about time. Then he says, we've got the cyclical time of agrarian communities, which is governed by the seasons. Then he says, into that kind of perpetual present, history starts to emerge. And history starts to emerge with the division of labor. And he's really explicit. You've got a division between the people who are kind of enabling a way of life and the people who are kind of governing that way of life and steering it. And I don't know if I can kind of really carry this off now, but I think that tension runs all the way through the chapter. That's kind of how he's thinking about class. And it's really quite abstract kind of way. It's basically those who are enabling a form of life, those who are steering it. And it's a kind of a funny reading of the idea that history is the history of class struggle, essentially. And it's taking him up to this kind of explosive moment he identifies in the present, where in a sense we're all enabling a way of life that no one's really in control of. Maybe we could do it. We could take charge, essentially. Now your question is, how do you go about doing that, right? And you know, right. So they're trying to steer kind of a line between spontaneism on the one hand, and their remarks, I forget where, but in the journal they say, you know, we don't like spontaneism. We're not keen on that. We don't. So a lot of the kind of the activism stuff that now gets viewed as situationism nowadays, I don't think they'd have been very keen on. I think they would have thought that's a bit directionless and kind of flapping about in various ways. But they're also quite worried about having some kind of revolutionary, so you know, Leninist bunch of leaders coming in and steering people in the right direction. They want to steer a line between the two. And I think the way in which they're trying to steer the line between the two is I think that the way I see Debord thinking about it, there's a long letter where he talks about how he's understanding the avant-garde back in like 62 or something like that. And it's straight out of Marx's letters to Ruger in 1843, where Marx is saying, you know, we don't tell the world what's really going on. You know, we don't confront the world in a doctrinaire fashion saying, here's the truth, kneel down before it. We show the world what it's really fighting for. We clarify, and the ideas are adopted and they're employed, or they're just wrong. And I think that's really how he's kind of seeing it. The role is to kind of generate the tools that people can pick up and use, the kind of theoretical tools. The task is to kind of clarify the nature of the situation so that people can respond to it and do something about it. I think that's how they see their role. Is that enough as an answer? I'm not sure if I'm hitting
all 70 of them.
Sorry,
there were only 70 people. Larence told us.
Well, when they finished, there was only 2. So, but yeah, I think that's broadly speaking.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Any other responses to the other questions that were just posed?
I could say something maybe about the conspiracy theory comment that was made earlier. I'm sorry, I forget who raised the question. But it's curious to sort of couch an inquiry like that, right, with the appeal for more concretion, to be more concrete, to be more contemporary, because there's actually something about, if you want to sort of identify some kind of patterns of this type of thinking, conspiracy thinking, as immensely abstract, insofar as certain little particular empirical details are emphasized and elevated, and they are abstractly connected to other particular details. And it's something then that gets, I think, sort of abstractly deduced that there's no such thing as coincidences, right? That two concrete sort of pieces of empirical life have to be related, and there has to be some kind of grand narrative to those seemingly circumstantial aspects of the way the world works today. How we then kind of relate that to spectacle, it would be a kind of I don't know. There are multiple ways of engaging with that question, whether it's sort of sort of grasping the way in which people are understanding politics today, the way in which people are understanding the circulation and immediacy of information today, this sort of immense kind of flooding of information that we have at a moment's notice. I think there's something to be said there about a structure of appearances this way that probably relates to a spectacular diagnosis. But it would really sort of, I think, depend on how we're understanding something like conspiracy theory, and whether or not we're saying there's anything novel about it, or what's novel about it within the present moment, right? What's novel about it at a time when such an immense amount of information and appearances of information are so readily available. So I think you'd have to sort of begin to qualify some of those elements of conspiracy thinking today. It's just a thought.
Thank you. Maybe I'll read a couple of more questions from the chat. The first is Debord's theory in need of an update based on the changes in the structure of modern capitalism? And the second question is, what is communism for Debord?
Yes, so I would say, yes, it needs a refresh, or as you call it. This is absolutely sure, because we do not favor to situationist theory if we take it as something like a truth for all times, because there have already been people who have this kind of how do you say, of worship for Debord and for situationist theory, as if this would be a kind of ultimate truth about our society. So naturally, Debord's ideas, as all other ideas, have to be reworked and to be put also into our times. So I think I would say that the situationist theory, the society of spectacle, is one of the few theories of social theories of the 60s which are still useful today, as might be maybe Marcuse and few others. But also it is the same discourse as for Marx himself. So it is a tool which we should use to develop our own thinking, not something which we could use. If we could apply letter by letter today, this would also be very much against Debord's own intentions, as Debord did when the Marx ideas detoured Marx ideas. So we also might use Debord's ideas to understand a world which is so different from Debord's world.
Would anyone else like to jump in and respond?
I could say something quickly. So in response, yes, firstly, I completely agree with Anselm. The situations are explicit, so we invite our own supersession. They hated what they call pro situs, who treated them as though they were a spectacle. So as I said earlier on, the way I'm understanding spectacle is this kind of you become fixated on something, you become subordinate to it effectively. They didn't want to be that. So they explicitly say, don't treat us as figureheads, don't treat us as leaders. The point is to kind of criticize and to move beyond. And I don't want to embarrass Anselm, but the letter that Debord wrote to you, he says, I really like your book. Your book's excellent, but you haven't been critical enough. You know, he was actually inviting more critique. He wanted to be kind of criticized more. So I don't think they would have ever wanted it to be treated like some kind of fixed, stable unit. And after all, much of the thought is really about moving with time, moving with change, thinking change. I think that's a big thing for Debord. It's part of the interest in strategy. Strategies have to think change as it kind of plays out in time. The question about communism is really interesting. And I'm just trying to look up, there's a lovely line in the preface to the fourth Italian edition where he says, I'll read this paragraph out. Maybe this is a bit, you know, it can begin easily enough wherever autonomous proletarian assemblies, not recognizing any authority outside themselves or the property of anyone whatsoever, placing their will above all laws and specializations, abolish the separation of individual, the commodity economy, and the state. It will only triumph by imposing itself universally, without leaving a patch of territory to any form of alienated society that still exists. There we will see again an Athens or a Florence that reaches to all the corners of the world, a city from which no one will be rejected, and which, having brought down all of its enemies, will at last be able to surrender itself joyously to the true divisions and never-ending confrontations of historical life. So it's going to be great, essentially.
Yes, but also to answer to the other question, I think that was the last optimistic statement in Debord's writing. So shortly afterwards, he had a sharp pessimistic turn in his writings, as well in the commentaries, and even more in his last project as the apology, of which Larence was talking us about. So he and especially also in his last film, Guy Debord, his art and his time. So he was really seeing a world falling apart around him. So naturally, we are not obliged to subscribe to this judgment, even if it is always necessary. I think, as said Walter Benjamin by quoting the Socialists, it is necessary to organize pessimism, but in order to have something to be optimistic about. And so naturally, also to answer Diogo's question, naturally, nobody can say now how we should react to the collapse, but I think at least we should not say the collapse is absolutely something which we cannot avoid and which we are forced to accept. On the other hand, naturally, it is also useless, I think, to say we should even go more in the same direction as does, for example, people who want to strengthen technology, so what is called accelerationism. So I think the important is really today, as said, to still quote Walter Benjamin, to take the emergency brake. This is also because I think it is important that Debord was also one of the first to acknowledge the importance of the ecological problems from the beginning of the 70s on. This is an aspect which we haven't talked about today, and which is very much against his Hegelian kind of optimism.
We should remark that Guy Debord left us a very non-optimistic last work, and we don't talk so much about that work. His last movie, he didn't realize it, but he wrote it, Guy Debord, son art et son temps. And it's a very, it's the film of the complete collapse. He described everything what would happen after. And he spent his life giving us the tools, the arms to fight, to think how to fight. But in his last movie, he describes such a collapse that we can think he was hopeless, I think, of what would happen after. And it's really necessary to see that movie.
Well, maybe with that, I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers today for joining us and everyone in the audience for taking time out